In this video, we are going to talk about grids with SwiftUI. In SwiftUI, we have two types of grid. One is LazyVGrid and other one is LazyHGrid. As the name suggests, the LazyVGrid is for creating vertical grids and the LazyHGrid is for creating horizontal grids. So why these grids are lazy? Assume that you have posted thousands of posts over the time on Instagram. So to load all the thousands of posts in a grid would take a lot of time. What Lazy does is that it only loads the grids which are visible to the user on the screen. So it will load only the grids which we can see on our iPhone device. So when you scroll your page and the remaining grids come up, then only they load. This is really good because it optimizes your app's performance. Instead of loading thousands of grids at once, which can take a lot of time, it only loads the grids which are visible to our user. Now, before jumping into code, I wanted to tell you about grid items as well. So grids are made of grid items. And what is grid items? Grid item is what you see in your grid. Like each item in the grid is nothing but grid item. With grid item, you can specify how many columns you need in your grid and how many rows you need. And there are multiple modifiers which you can use with grid items. The one which is being used a lot is the size modifier. So with size modifier, you can specify whether the number of item you see in your grid would be of fixed size or it would be of flexible size or it would be adaptive. So with fixed size, all the grid items would be of fixed size, and the drawback with fixed grid item is if there is not enough space on your device, it can go out of the view, which might not look that good. With flexible, if there is not enough space, the grid item would go in the next row or in the next column, but it would never go off the screen. And it also tries to maintain the number of column you have specified. Like if you say that I want 3 columns, then with flexible, it will try to create 3 columns. But if there's not enough space, then it will just create 2 columns. With fixed, if you specify that I want 3 columns, then it will definitely create 3 columns, even if your UI looks distorted and your grids are going off the screen. Whereas with adaptive, you won't be able to specify how many rows or column you need in your grid. It just fills the grid with the number of grid item you have given. So this was a little brief about grid items. So let's jump right into the code and start coding our lazy grids. So let's remove this text and start coding our lazy V grid first. So lazy V, and then you can see we are getting this option with columns and contents. So let's select that. With columns, we need to specify the number of columns we can have in our lazy V grid with grid items. So instead of creating over here, let's create a variable, and then in that variable we'll specify how many number of columns we need and how our grid items would look like. So let's create column. This would be of array of grid item, and then inside an array we will create our grid items. Let's say we need only 1 column in our grid, so we'll create one grid item. And which type of grid item you want? Do you want it of type fixed, like with fixed width and height, or do you want it to be flexible or adaptive? So in this example, let's see how the fixed grid item looks like. So we'll say dot fixed, and we can give it some fixed size. So let's give it a fixed size of 50. And then over here, I can specify my columns for the column. And then in content, instead of text, let's create rectangle so it would be much clearer. As you can see, I got a rectangle. Let's give it a height as well so that we can see it properly. With height of, let's give it a 50 height, and there we have it. We have one rectangle inside our grid and we have only one column as well. Let's copy paste these rectangle and create 4-5 rectangles. So we have now 5 rectangles and we have only one column because we specified only one grid item in our column. Let's say I want 2-3 columns more, so I'll just copy this line and paste it 2 times, separate it with comma, and now you should have 3 columns. Now we have 3 columns, and since we had 5 rectangles, it has equally distributed the rectangles in these 3 columns. In the first 2 columns, you can see two rectangles, and in the next column we have one rectangle. You can keep copy pasting like this and see how your grid looks like, or we can create a for each loop with a lot of grid items. So let's delete this and create a for each loop to get lots of rectangles so that we can see how LazyVGrid looks like. So let's create for each, and we'll take this range with content one, and in the range we'll specify less than 50. So we want to create 50 rectangles, and in content let's just copy our code from here and put it over here. So as you can see, it is going off the screen and I'm not able to scroll it. I have 50 rectangles in 3 columns, but it's going off the screen because we don't have enough space in the 3 columns. You can fix this by specifying 2 more columns, and then now we have 5 columns with 50 grid items. Now because the number of grid are 50, that's why we can see in this screen. But what if our number of grids were 100? Now it will go off the screen again. How we can fix it? You can again specify more grid items and it will try to adjust it over here, but it will mostly go off the screen. Or one thing you can do is create a scroll view, and inside the scroll view you can put your grid, and now all these grids would be scrollable. Now you can see all your 100 grids which would be scrollable. For your columns you can give different width as well. So instead of 50, let's say in the center I want 100 width for one of my grid. So you can see the center grid is now 100, and let's see, even the last grid I want to make it like 150. So if we do that, because we do not have enough space, the grid items are going off the screen. And that is what I was saying. The fixed grid items will try to show the number of columns which you have specified. Let's say we have given 5 columns. So you can see 5 columns, but not all the columns are showing all the data correctly. If we specify one more column with 150, it will try to show again one more column. It won't be able to show everything because it is going off the screen and we do not have enough space in our iPhone. Now, how do we fix it? We have something called flexible. So if we say flexible instead of fixed, and we can remove this, we don't need to give these fixed size. Let's just change it with flexible. Now with flexible, you won't be able to give fixed size, but as you can see, all our columns you can see now, and it has distributed all the columns equally in our screen. So we have 6 columns, and each of these columns have equal space to show their data. And we can scroll as well because it is inside a scroll view. With flexible, you have option to give minimum width and minimum height as well. So I can give minimum width of, let's say, 50, and maximum width would be of 100. Now in the next one, let's say I want to give minimum width of 100 and maximum width of 200. Now what it would do is the second column is now little bigger, and rest of the columns has adjusted their width. So the first column is with width 50 and the second column is with 100 because we have specified minimum width for both of these columns, but the rest of the 4 columns we did not specify any minimum width or maximum width. That's why it is taking the rest of the space only. Now the last size modifier with grid item was adaptive. So we can say adaptive, and let's remove all of this. So all these 6 columns are now considered as one column. So let's say if I give one more column in this, now you're not seeing any change because the minimum width is 50 itself. So let's give it a minimum width of 100. Now what it is doing is the first 3 columns are considered as one column, and this last column is considered as one column. And if you give one more column in this with, let's say, 150, now it is basically considering the first 2 column as the first column, third column as the second column, and the fourth column is the third column. So instead of 3 columns, you're seeing 4 columns because that's much the screen can show. So with adaptive, whatever your screen can show, it will show all of those items. So adaptive can get a little confusing, and the fixed size modifier is something which you should avoid because your UI might get distorted if you use fixed, and adaptive can be a little confusing. The best one is the flexible. So the flexible size modifier is the one which you will be using quite a lot when you are creating your UI with SwiftUI. Now let's remove all that and let's take a simple example for LazyHGrid as well. So let's create a LazyHGrid, and instead of columns, now we have rows. So let's create rows, and we can specify our grid items as we did for columns. So we can say grid items, and let's create it with a fixed grid item of 50. Now I can say row over here, and then let's create our rectangles, and we want to give it a frame of, let's say, width of 50, and let's put it in a for each loop so that we have multiple rectangles. And then for content, we want our rectangle inside the for each loop. As we have only one row, it is showing only one row, so let's create multiple rows as well. So let's do like 4 rows. We can separate it with comma, and now I should have 4 rows with rectangles of width 50. I can change the size of each row as well. So let's say I want to see this row a little bigger, so I can say, let's say 100, and now this row would be of size 100, as you can see over here. You can play around with flexible and adaptive size modifier as well for LazyHGrid. Now that we know LazyVGrid and LazyHGrid and how to use these size modifier and how to use grid items, let's look into a real world example and let's create our Instagram page. It would be a sample Instagram page, not an actual one with real data. So let's jump right into it and create our Instagram page. So instead of LazyHGrid, now we want a LazyVGrid, and instead of rows, we want columns. Let's change over here as well, and instead of fixed, we want our columns to be flexible, and we don't want to specify any minimum width or height. So let's remove this and let's create 3 columns. Remove the fixed columns, and we don't want to give width for our rectangle, we want to give it a height of, let's say, 100, and let's give it a scroll view so that we can scroll as well. Now we have something like this, which looks something similar to what we see at the bottom of our Instagram profile. Let's give it a fill color. Let's give it a color of red. Okay, and now on top of our grid, we have like top section with image and data about your profile. So we can create that. Instead of creating all the data, I'll just create a simple image. So above your LazyVGrid, let's create an image, and I have my motivation image still with me. So I'll use that, and then let's use resizable, give it aspect ratio of, let's use fill itself, this looks much better, and then give this frame a height so that it doesn't go too much at the bottom. So let's say 500 would be good. And now this looks like our Instagram profile where we have our image on the top, and then at the bottom we have our post. There's one more thing we can do is we can create section for our grids. So in the content, instead of just directly creating the grids, I can create a section as well. And in the section, I have multiple settings. We can just have a title and then content for the section, or I can have a header as well with the content. So let's create a header, and in the content, we want this content like our rectangle. So let's give that content, and in the header, I want to have a text. Let's have a simple text saying post, so it will show all the post. And then you can have anything over here for your header. You can have a tab where you specify whether you're showing post or reels or whatever is there on the Instagram page. But as of now, I have just created a simple text only. Let's give some modifiers to this text so that it looks more like a header. So we will give it a foreground color of white, so foreground style, and then we'll say white, and then let's give it a font of title, then let's give it a frame with max width of infinity. And since our foreground color is white, we're not able to see the text, so let's give it a background color as well. So background, and we will give it a gray color, and now this looks much like a header. You can pin this header as well. So if you go to your LazyVGrid, we have something called pinned columns. So if you just click over here and press Control space, you will see all the options you can specify for your LazyVGrid. You can specify the alignment, you can specify the content. We already have the content, which is what we are showing in our grid. You can have pinned views as well and spacing. With pinned view, you can specify section. So I can say section header, and now our section header should be pinned and it won't go off the screen. Now there's one more thing in this LazyVGrid, you can specify spacing as well. So let's specify some spacing. By default, it is giving some spacing of like 6 or 8. between these rows and columns. If you want to remove the spacing, you can just give like 0 spacing and see how it works. And as you can see, it has removed the spacing between our rows. If you want to remove the spacing between our column, you can specify that in your grid items. So over here, if you go and put comma and click on control space, you will see two options, alignment and spacing. We can give alignment of center or leading or whatever alignment you want. I'm happy with my alignment, so I won't go for it. But let's see spacing. And if you want to remove the spacing between these columns, you can give over here a number 0. And now the spacing between the first column and second column is now removed. If you want to remove it for next column as well, you can give the same spacing in the next column. And now all the spacing between your grids are removed. Let's switch it back. Let's give it 6 spacing for rows and columns. And now it looks more like a grid. So this is how simple it is to use LazyVGrid and LazyHGrid and design these kind of complex UI with just few lines of code with SwiftUI. This is it with this video. If you like this video, then do not forget to like and subscribe and share it with your friends. Thank you so much for watching. Bye bye.